Welcome to the debate.
And I am the dissenter.
Today, we are dissecting a text that really attempts to rewire the fundamental circuitry of spiritual and social thought. We're looking at Holiness and Holism, Embracing the Divine Interconnectedness by Joseph Garrity. And this book, it's not just a theological suggestion, or some guide to better living. It is a structural critique of Western civilization itself. Garrity argues that we've constructed our entire reality, our laws, our genders, our relationship to the earth, on a fundamental mistake.
A mistake is putting it pretty mildly. Garrity basically contends that the very architecture of Western religion, and specifically the mechanism of separation, is a pathology. He's taking aim at thousands of years of tradition to ask, really, a singular and I think dangerous question. Does holiness require us to be set apart from the world, or does it require us to be, dissolved into it?
And that is the core tension. We are debating definitions. Is holiness defined by purity through isolation, the whole set-apart idea, or is it defined by wholeness, an embrace of total interconnectedness? The answer determines whether we see the world as a hierarchy to be conquered or a web to be tended. So today, I'll be arguing for Garrity's thesis that this fallacy of separation is the root of our ecological and social crises, and that true sanctity is found in unity.
And I'll be taking the opposing view. I will argue that Garrity's holism, while it's poetic and certainly on trend, is practically and morally dissolving. I believe that without separation, without clear boundaries and distinctions, the very concept of sacredness loses all its utility. If everything is holy, then, nothing is. We need fences to make good neighbors, and we need categories to make sense of the divine.
Okay, so let's establish the groundwork before we start tearing down any fences. Garrity begins by defining holism not as some vague spirituality, but as a structural philosophy where the whole is distinct from and greater than the sum of its parts. He posits that traditional religion relies on binary processing, sacred versus profane, male versus female, saved versus damned. And he argues this isn't just a classification system. It's a hierarchy of value that inevitably leads to hypocrisy and exclusion.
It leads to categories. Whether those categories are hypocritical is a matter of execution, I would argue, not definition.
But the text argues the definition forces the execution. Garrity asserts that holiness is about integration. It is the act of being fully enmeshed in the web of life. And he bases this on just observing reality itself. To quote the text, "The universe operates in dynamic systems of unity, balance, and interdependence. From the subatomic to the galactic, isolation is a myth." So a theology based on isolation is, it's a lie.
That is a very strong assertion, but it ignores the linguistic and historical bedrock of the conversation. As Garrity himself acknowledges, though he does try to pivot away from it, the etymology of the Hebrew word for holy, kadosh, literally means set apart. It doesn't mean mixed in, it means cut off, distinct. To be holy is to be removed from common usage for a special purpose. A temple vessel is holy because you don't drink beer out of it. The Sabbath is holy because you do not work on it. The definition is entirely reliant on that distinction from the mundane.
But does that setting apart necessitate a rejection of the beer or of the drinker? This is where Garrity draws a line. He argues that we've taken kadosh and frankly weaponized it.
Weaponized how? By having standards?
By creating a castic system of existence. If I am set apart, I am better than. Garrity argues this creates a kind of spiritual narcissism where we see ourselves as external to the system. If I'm holy because I am separate from nature, then nature just becomes a resource to be exploited rather than a body I'm part of. If I'm holy because I am saved and you are damned, then I have no moral obligation to even try to understand you.
I think that's a very cynical reading of tradition. I mean, setting apart implies a difference in quality and responsibility, not necessarily a license to destroy. My primary concern with Garrity's argument is that it conflates existence with goodness. If we dissolve all boundaries in favor of this web of life, we lose the very mechanism for moral discernment. Separation is how we identify value. We separate the wheat from the chaff. We separate truth from lies. If I can't separate right from wrong because I'm too busy contemplating the oneness of it all, moral clarity just dissolves into a gray fog.
Garrity would call that fog nuance. But let's look at how he dismantles this binary thinking, specifically with his fallacy of separation. He uses a metaphor from physics that I think is absolutely central to the book's logic: the magnet.
Yes, the unified field argument.
And it's such a powerful refutation of dualism. Garrity points out that we look at a magnet and we see a north pole and a south pole, and we think of them as opposites. But that's an optical illusion. They are expressions of a single field. You can't have one without the other. If you cut a magnet in half, you don't get a standalone north pole. You get two smaller magnets, each with both poles.
Physically, that's undeniable. It's a dipole, sure.
And he applies this to our social binaries: light and dark, male and female, self and other. These aren't opposing enemies trying to conquer each other. They're complementary tensions within a unified field. Garrity argues that the harm in our society comes when we try to sever the poles, when we try to have us without them or man without woman as if they're alien species. He specifically notes this dualistic thinking is the engine of xenophobia and racism. It allows us to see the other as an external contaminant rather than a necessary part of the whole.
I struggle with the leap from electromagnetism to sociology. It feels like a category error. As a description of a physical force, the magnet metaphor works perfectly. As a prescription for human behavior, it's shaky.
But why? We are physical beings living in that physical universe. Why should our social laws contradict the laws of physics?
Because unlike a magnet, human society requires distinct functions to operate. Even within the magnet, the North Pole is not the South Pole. They have distinct interactions with the world. If you neutralize that difference, the magnet creates no field. It becomes just a lump of iron. The power exists because of the tension of opposites. Garrity seems to want to resolve this tension into some soup of oneness, but I'd argue that the tension is what generates culture and art, and even morality. We need the other to define the self. Without the boundary, who am I?
But Garrity isn't asking to destroy the poles. He's asking us to stop warring against the other end of our own magnet. He wants us to recognize the field. And nowhere is this war more evident than in the realm of gender. This is where Holiness and Holism gets very specific and, frankly, very challenging for traditionalists. Garrity applies this field theory to identity, arguing that gender is a spectrum of field rather than a binary switch.
He does rely very heavily on the spectrum model, yes.
And he brings receipts. He cites neurobiological evidence about brain structure, showing that masculine and feminine traits in the brain exist on a continuum, not in two neat little boxes. But the theological argument is what interested me most. He points to indigenous traditions that didn't just tolerate, but venerated this spectrum. He discusses the two-spirit people in Native American cultures, the Hijra in South Asia, and the Samoan Fa'afafine.
These are well-documented anthropological categories, certainly.
But look at their function. In many of these cultures, these individuals were seen as more holy because they bridged the divide. They were the synthesis of the poles. Garrity contrasts this with the Western view, which he calls fractured. He brings up the concept of divine androgyny, referencing deities like Arden or Ishvara in Hinduism or Hermaphroditus in Greek mythology, to suggest the divine is a unification of traits. His point is that by enforcing a strict binary, we are literally cutting off parts of the divine magnet. We create a fractured soul in our own community.
That's a compelling narrative for inclusivity, I'll grant you that. But I do have to ask, does removing these categories liberate people, or does it just leave them without a map?
A map to what?
To themselves, to their role in the tribe. Traditional structures, masculine and feminine archetypes, are not just oppressive chains, they are psychological frameworks. They're stories we enter into. If you tell a young person there is no script, there are no boundaries, you're a fluid point on an infinite spectrum, that can be inducive of profound anxiety. It's the paralysis of infinite choice.
Or the freedom of authentic expression.
Perhaps. But I also question the methodology of sort of redefining theology to match modern sociology. When Garrity talks about divine androgyny, is he engaging in rigorous theology, or is he just projecting 21st century secular values onto ancient texts? It feels like we are bending the sacred to fit the current moment, rather than allowing the sacred to challenge us. If the web validates everything we already want to do, is it a religion or is it just a mirror?
I think Garrity would say he's wiping the steam off the mirror so we can see what was always there. These identities existed long before modern sociology. They were just erased by the specific separation theology you're defending. But let's move to where this theory leaves the theoretical and hits the dirt, the environment. For me, this was the irrefutable section of the book. Garrity introduces the Wood Wide Web.
The mycorrhizal networks, the fungal internet, yes.
Exactly. We used to look at a forest and see individual trees competing for light. That was a separation model. Now, thanks to the science Garrity cites, we know those trees are connected underground by fungal threads, sharing nutrients, sending distress signals, even keeping old stumps alive. It proves the text's assertion: no organism exists in isolation. But the most striking example for me was the trophic cascade of the Yellowstone wolves.
It is a classic case study in systems theory, for sure.
But view it through the lens of holiness. When wolves were reintroduced, they didn't just control the elk population. Because the elk moved to higher ground to avoid the wolves, the willow and aspen trees on the riverbanks recovered. Because the trees recovered, the soil held firm. The rivers actually changed course and deepened. The wolves changed the geography. Garrity uses this to argue that the dominion theology, this idea that humans are separate from and above nature, is a suicide pact. We are part of the trophic cascade. Holiness must include stewardship because we are not outside the system.
I agree entirely on the need for stewardship, and the science of the wolf reintroduction is sound. However, I fundamentally disagree with the philosophical conclusion Garrity draws from it. He seems to be romanticizing nature as a blueprint for human morality.
How can it not be a blueprint? Nature is the system that sustains us.
Because nature is a slaughterhouse. The mechanism of that beautiful trophic cascade you just described is predation. The wolf tears the throat out of the elk. That is how the river gets fixed. Suffering and death are the engines of that balance. If we say nature is holy and we are one with nature, are we then justifying survival of the fittest in human society?
That feels like a distortion of the argument. Garrity isn't suggesting we adopt the morality of a wolf.
Is it a distortion, though? If the web of life is our moral compass, why shouldn't the strong eat the weak? I mean, that stabilizes the ecosystem, doesn't it? Traditional concepts of holiness, the set apart, often call humans to transcend their natural instincts. We are called to protect the weak, which is unnaturally inefficient. We are called to be better than wolves. I care for my garden, but I do not believe I am a petunia. I'm the gardener. That distinction is vital. If I'm just another plant, I have no duty to prune.
That's a clever line, but you're missing the spiritual depth of Garrity's integration. He's not saying we mimic the predation. He's saying we recognize the consequence. The dominion model allows us to pollute the river because we think we aren't the river. The holistic model forces us to realize that poisoning the water is poisoning our own blood. This brings us to the irony of division the text talks about.
Go on.
Garrity critiques the hypocrisy of orthodoxy. We have religious institutions preaching universal love, unity, and charity, yet their defining feature is exclusion. Who's in, who's out. He discusses the psychological concept of the illusionary truth effect. We believe these false binaries, we are the chosen, they are the damned, simply because we hear them repeated over and over in liturgy. He pushes for a both-and approach, rather than either-or. He argues that we can hold the paradox. We can be distinct individuals and part of the whole.
Both and is a very comfortable place to sit philosophically, but practically, it often leads to a lack of conviction.
How so?
Well, if all paths are valid, and all things are holy, and everything is just a shade on a spectrum, What motivates specific ethical behavior? What motivates discipline? If I'm already holy just by virtue of existing in the web, why should I strive for anything?
Because you understand your impact on the web. You strive because you know your vibration affects the whole field. It shifts the burden from obedience to a distant God to responsibility to the immediate neighbor.
I think that's a very abstract motivation. History shows that exclusive truth claims, the idea that this specific thing is right and that specific thing is wrong, create strong, cohesive communities. And those communities are capable of immense sacrifice and charity precisely because they have a defined boundary. They have an identity. I fear that the diffuse, holistic spirituality Garrity proposes might feel good, but it won't hold a community together when things get tough. It just dissolves into a vague sense of wellness, rather than a rigorous pursuit of the good.
I see that concern, but let me offer a different perspective from the final chapter. Garrity isn't arguing for a lack of rigor. He's arguing against a rigor that destroys. He calls for the integration of the self. The rigor comes from the incredibly difficult work of seeing the divine in the person you have been trained to hate. That is much harder than simply following a dietary code or staying on your side of the set-apart fence.
I will concede that point. Loving one's enemy is the most difficult dogma, and perhaps the most neglected.
Exactly. The text moves toward a conclusion that holiness is an active state of becoming whole. It's not a static badge you earn by separation. It's a dynamic process of integrating the self, the community, and the earth.
And I will admit, Holiness and Holism offers a necessary corrective. We have certainly seen the damage that toxic exclusion and environmental neglect can cause. If this book stops one person from demonizing a stranger or poisoning a watershed, it has value.
But
I maintain that the knife of separation remains a vital tool. We need the knife to cut the bread, even if our goal is to feed everyone. We need distinction to have discernment. Perhaps true holiness is the ability to maintain one's distinct identity, to be Kadash, while still engaging with the whole. I want to be a distinct pole in the magnet, not just part of the metal.
that's a fair synthesis. Though I would frame it that the survival of the planet and the healing of our social fractures depend on us realizing that the knife is often an illusion. We are the bread, the knife, and the eater. Garrity's vision isn't about destroying distinction. It's about ending alienation. It's about recognizing the web before it unravels completely.
It leaves us with a great deal to consider. Whether you see the magnet as one field or two poles, the force is undeniable.
Indeed. We want to thank you for joining us for this intellectual exchange. We hope this debate has illuminated the text for you.
And we encourage you to observe the binaries in your own life this week, question if they serve a purpose or if they merely create a barrier.